Hello again, my name's Kehoe, the chairman of UKIP in Erewash, and I'm doing a series of talks on the UKIP manifesto, and very recently I've started a mini-series on the subject of Brexit, which is item 1 in the manifesto. This is the 4th talk in that little mini-series, and today I'm looking at what Mrs May and the British government should have done in negotiating with the EU and in comparison what they have done. So, what we should have done after the referendum, within a very short space of time, is simply repealed the European Communities Act of 1972. Now that was the Act of Parliament by which the Prime Minister then, Ted Heath, took us into what was then called the European Economic Community. We were told it was just a common market and it was solely about trade, and he specifically denied that it involved any loss of sovereignty. That was a lie he told at the time, and which he later on in his life, long after he'd retired, he admitted that that had been a lie, and that when he said it, he knew that it did involve a very major loss of sovereignty. But there you are. Anyway, the point is, we should have simply repealed that act, and had we done so, everything else would have fallen away with it, because everything that came out of the next 40 years, all the treaties, all the different directives, all the rest of it, flows from that act by which sovereignty over the United Kingdom was passed from the Queen in Parliament to the European, what's now become the European Union. And so, if we had done that at the beginning, our entire negotiating procedure would have been completely different. We'd have been negotiating from strength, showing them right at the beginning that we meant business and that we were immediately an independent nation acting for itself, speaking for itself, acting in its own interests, certainly with diplomacy, certainly with more than a willingness and eagerness to do deals and to trade with people, of course, but from a position of strength, not from a position of supine weakness, as we have done. So in addition, what we should have done was repeal the European Elections Act of 2002, by which it arranges that we elect members of the European Parliament. We should have let them know there'll be no more MEPs, that's over. We should also have at least amended the Interpretations Act of 1978, under which it provides that judgments of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, as came later, would be binding upon us and would be binding precedents in our system. And we should have simply said that those past judgments that have been done in the 40 odd years since we've been in the European Union or community would not apply to us, and we'd specify any that we are prepared to have apply to us. And of course, from now on, any judgments of those courts would be completely inapplicable to us, whereas by contrast, they remain applicable to us, even now, and they'll continue to be. And of course, we should have also set about repealing European Union-derived legislation concerning immigration, trade, farming, fishing, security, defence, police, and so on. We should have just started throwing out that sort of legislation that came from the EU and begun to replace it with our own. Of course, we did none of that. Instead of doing what I'm saying here, and which is what UKIP said she should have done, right from the beginning UKIP was saying that's what you should do. Instead, the British government chose, in the most feeble way, to go through the Article 50 procedure of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, that's an alternative provision set out within the treaty to enable a country to leave the European Union. It was only put in as an afterthought, and it was never envisaged that anybody would ever use it. It was never intended to be used. It was designed not to be used. It was designed to be unattractive and such that you wouldn't want to use it. But what did our government do? Instead of just getting their coat and leaving and walking out, they set about going through this absurd procedure. So what happened? Mrs May, first of all, did nothing whatsoever for about 9 months. From June 16 to March 17, she did nothing at all. And then she triggered Article 50, the exit clause from the treaty, and she then spent 2 years doing almost nothing at all, during which she was supposedly negotiating a deal to leave the European Union, the famous deal that she's now trying to urge upon us. But the deal that she negotiated was absolutely terrible, and in the last talk I went through what was wrong with it. But one of the things she did, which I thought was extraordinary, was that in her dealings with the European Union, right from the start, when she became Prime Minister, she excluded the Brexit Secretary. She invented this new cabinet post called the Brexit Secretary, which was supposed to be the Minister or Secretary of State responsible for exiting the European Union. But she wouldn't allow him, David Davis, she wouldn't allow him to actually do any of the negotiating. And the same was true of his successor after that. Now, what she did instead, she kept the negotiations to herself and a civil servant who isn't even a politician, he's not even a minister, a man called Ollie Robbins, who is an absolute arch Remainer. I mean, off the top of the scale in terms of the intensity of his devotion to the European Union. And that's the man that she gave the task of negotiating with the EU for our exit from the EU. Now, can you see why it didn't work? You put a man in charge of negotiating our departure from the EU who is determined to stay in the EU with all his heart and mind and soul. He wants to stay in. And she herself, Mrs. May, campaigned to remain, and she has continued to be, in her heart and mind and soul, wedded to the idea of remain. That's why she's doing what she did. That's the only way you can explain why she put that man in charge of the negotiations. But it doesn't stop there. What she went on to do was to reveal her negotiating position publicly. Now, who on earth does that? Even the most junior person, even the most inexperienced person. If you were negotiating with someone to buy a car or to buy something on eBay or buy something at a car boot sale, would you reveal your negotiating position publicly in front of everybody? But that's what she did. Incredible, incredible naivety or stupidity or malice or treachery, more likely. But of late, just very recently, it's got worse. Parliament has actually voted that we must not leave the European Union without a deal, that we must have a deal. Now, can you believe how incredible and stupid that is? You're effectively saying to your opponent, the EU, that we're negotiating with you now, but we're not going to walk away. We're not going to leave until we have a deal with you. Nothing will induce us to leave without a deal that you will give us. Now imagine, what does that do to your opponent? What incentive does that give to your opponent to make any concession or to act reasonably? None. They've behaved appallingly, the EU have, and yet we have continued to put up with it and to bow down before them and kiss their shoes in order to beg from them and plead with them for things that we might have. So, Mrs. May then negotiated this absurd deal that I spoke of last time, and she presented it to Parliament, and unsurprisingly it wasn't accepted because it's absolutely terrible. Everybody can see that. So it was defeated by a majority of about 230. So what did she do? She came back and presented it again. This time it was defeated by a majority of about 149. And what is she going to do now? She's going to bring it back again, the same proposal, and put it to Parliament again. 3 times making the same proposal to Parliament. Now, she must be aware that she's not allowed to do that. The rules, the parliamentary procedures don't permit a government to keep presenting the same motion to the House of Commons after it's been voted against. But you see, when they're dealing with the EU, when they're dealing with these things, they don't care what the rules are. They don't care what the law is. They just do whatever they want to do. They are completely without scruple and without any concern for the law or for honour or for promises. Now, why did she do all this? Why has Mrs. May acted in this way? The most commonly held view is that she's just completely incompetent, that she's naive, she has no negotiating skills, that she's just basically lacks, she's way above her pay grade and she lacks the competence to do the job. But I don't believe that, because I don't believe anyone can possibly be as incompetent as that. It just can't be possible. And if it was possible, if it was the case, her colleagues would get rid of her. If they knew that she was incompetent, they would get rid of her. They're keeping her in place because she's doing what they want her to do. They want her to cause Brexit to fail, and for it either not to happen at all or for it to happen purely in name only. And that is exactly what we are seeing. And remember, the only reason we ever had a referendum in the first place is because the previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, promised one. But why did he do that? He only did it in order to try to take the rug out from under the UKIP party, which was wanting a referendum. And he thought, if I offer a referendum, people won't need to vote for UKIP. Well, that was his idea. And the snag was, he didn't expect to win that election. He expected to end up in coalition again. That's what all the polls were saying. And what he fully expected was that the Liberal Democrats, who were against a referendum, would have then said, you can't have one, we're not having it. But guess what? He won the election with a big surprise of about a 20 majority. So he suddenly found himself able and obligated to carry out his manifesto promise of having a referendum. So he very reluctantly set about doing so. But what did he do? He spent millions of pounds of public money campaigning against Brexit, against leave, and most of the media helped him, and the government, all the powers of the government were used to campaign against us voting leave. But what did we do? We voted leave. Now, if they hadn't done all that, the leave vote would have been far higher. But then what did they do? Having got the unexpected leave vote, they immediately set about sabotaging the whole Brexit project. So, what we have now is a government that has no patriotism. They don't know the meaning of the word. They have no self-respect. They have no respect for our country. They have no common sense. They have no loyalty to the United Kingdom. They are cooperating with and seeking to assist a foreign power in its dealings against the United Kingdom. That is called treason. And this is happening at the highest levels of the British government, aided and abetted by goodness knows how many ministers and other MPs and civil servants. It is a mass act of treason against the United Kingdom. That's what they've done, instead of simply obeying our command as an electorate to take us out of the European Union. Okay, well, thank you for listening. If you like that, then please say so. Please comment, please share. That really helps. Thank you very much.